Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning to those that are connecting from the US. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Leila Sadiku. I am the team leader for innovation at UNDP Europe and Central Asia. And I'm delighted to navigate today, this day together with you. This is an ongoing dialogue that we have with our partners at DG NEAR. It's a way for us to jointly explore how to do development differently as we recognize the unprecedented complexity and speed of change and challenges that we face around the world and in this region as well. We'll hear today from leaders, from policymakers, from practitioners and thinkers who are taking radically different approaches from business as usual. Today is dedicated really to bridging together practice with thinking, trying to answer some key questions like what does it take for us to work on system transformation? How do we move beyond language? And actually, what are the types of changes that we need to see within the spaces where we work in order to be able to embrace this in practice? Ultimately, what is required, and building on the knowledge and experience from our speakers who will be here today, also what is emerging from the new practice on working on system transformation and especially deploying portfolio approaches. So there's many questions ahead. I hope that today will be a space where we start to answer some of them. And without taking further time, let me invite our hosts, Ben Slade, who's the Acting Deputy Regional Director for UNDP Europe and Central Asia, and Mathieu Bousquet, Acting Director at DG NEAR, Thematic Support for Coordination of Policy and Financial Instruments, for welcoming remarks. Thank you very much.
Dear Deputy Prime Minister Bitici, dear speakers, partners, and colleagues, dear Mathieu, I'm honored to open this event, a dialogue which we started almost 2 years ago, on how to address the increasing interdependence and complexity in the development challenges we face. The upcoming meeting in Glasgow is likely to highlight the deep, interconnected, and structural nature of the climate challenges facing us. As The Economist this past week has noted, financing gaps, underlying systems, and power dynamics are all likely to hinder change at the scale that is required. Moreover, we have seen decades of progress erased during the last 2 years due to the pandemic, especially in terms of women's empowerment, poverty reduction, and inequalities. The scale of the challenges we face and the speed at which they can move require new ways of understanding these challenges and community-based adaptive responses, as well as shorter learning cycles. All this has implications for the design of development programming. This is particularly the case in terms of going from single-point solutions to portfolio approaches. It also concerns shifting to longer-term development programming and embracing partnerships that are based on rigorous discovery and learning. Shift resonates strongly in UNDP's newly adopted strategic plan, which emphasizes systemic transformations and portfolio development, among other things. Some 24 UNDP country offices around the world are now using portfolio approaches to unpack and strategically address and generate options for policymakers with support from the EU, Denmark, Slovakia, and other partners. Our partnership with the EU is key to these processes in the region and beyond. The Mayors for Economic Growth facility is of strategic significance, as through dialogues like this, we can open the space to move from projects towards joint learning on system transformation. Building on the dialogues we have had in the past with the likes of Sir John Kay, today we hear from policymakers and thought leaders who have taken bold actions in response to the need and urgency that is recognized. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
So good afternoon, everybody. From my side, I'm Mathieu Bousquet from the European Commission. So this is already the third seminar we organized jointly with UNDP with a view to provoke a new way of looking at the future, opening the space for collaboration between different actors committed to system innovation. And I'm very happy to introduce and welcome the participants and colleagues, and in particular, the panelists, Mr. Fatmir Bitici, Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of North Macedonia, Duncan Green, professor and author of How Change Happens, Garo Armen, founder and CEO of Agenus and founder and chairman of Children of Armenia, Kirsten Dunlop, Chief Executive Officer, Climate Kick, Giulio Quagiotto, Head of Strategic Innovation for UNDP, Indy Johar, Chief Executive and founder of Dark Matter Lab, and Ines Rocha, Director for Financial Products at EBAD, and now two moderators, Hoa-Binh Adjemian, my deputy, and Francine Pickup, the resident representative of UNDP Serbia. Let, of course, me thank Bensley and Leila for having organized this event. Even if the new reality has become the so-called norm, we have been and we are still in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. So what started 2 years ago as a sanitary crisis evolved into an economic crisis with a third of population in lockdown at a point of time. Hospitals still having difficulties coping with emergencies, unemployment remains high, disenfranchised population suffers, illiquidity leads to insolvency, the globalized economic model is questioned, and social distancing and teleworking have become the norm, with vaccine, one of the few hopes for the future. So we had to face the biggest global health crisis for a century, the deepest global economic crisis for decades, and the gravest planetary crisis of all time. The speed of events and the enormity of the challenges was and is still difficult to grasp, but another crisis is in the making. And we all know about it. We are getting dangerously close to 1.5 degrees of global warming, a tipping point or a point of non-return. Science tells us it is not too late yet. Well, probably 1.5 might be already too late, more 2.2, but okay. But we must certainly hurry up. And I have to tell you that I'm very proud of the EU commitment to become the first climate neutral continent and of our commitment to our enlargement and neighborhood partners to support a green and fair transition. I'm also convinced that our political and financial commitments will be reconfirmed next week in Glasgow, and I'm hopeful that the world will engage in the right trajectory. But the question that gathers us today is not the why, but the how. And I like to set a certain number of questions. How to transform a vision to become a good ancestor, to stand up for tomorrow's challenges while ensuring that our economies work for all. How to move from billion to trillion, crowding in private sector finance and expertise while increasing qualitatively our impact. How to be actors of change and from a personal viewpoint, walk the extra mile, but also ensuring work-life balance. How to build on innovative practices and move from experimentation to scale. How to engage with complex systems where the collective behavior of their parts entails emergence of properties that can hardly, if not at all, be inferred from properties of the parts. How to better be actors of change or better dance with the system, as Professor Green explained in his book. How to create or orchestrate solutions when obliquity seems to be the only approach, and we discussed that last time with Professor Kay, and how to reconcile this understanding with our institutional processes. How to engage with organic, self-organized groups like cities, societies, and economies, when our tools have been developed to fix complicated engineered machineries, and how to sustain our curiosity, our humility, and our reflexivity to build better program interventions and policies jointly with our partners. The seminar is about the how, as we are all convinced about the why we need to change for the benefit of all the citizens that are born and the citizens of the future, the ones to be born. So I'm really thrilled by our UNDP near partnership, which explores the possible, which awakes our curiosity, and which allows us to meet exceptional actors of change and leaders of the world and to better participate to make our world a better place. So let's engage with the how now, and thank you one more time for joining this event. Thank you very much.
World really trying their best to figure out what is the best response. How do you balance between health and the economy? And I think we see doing this in real time as we were feeling the effects across different sectors. Now, the Republic of North Macedonia responded to this by also building in adaptiveness into their future national development strategy. So I invite you to watch a short video, which is really about how do you design around building for societal capabilities for transition and transformation.
The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerability of our economies and societies. We're living in an age of long, interlinked emergencies. Some challenges like climate change, pandemics, migration, and stalling human development are acutely present today. Others will unfold over time spans beyond what we can imagine or plan for. What is known or knowable today will be distorted by events that we cannot predict and unknowable cascading risks. How we use our land and resources and what we learn and value today will have ramifications for future generations. However, our current systems are struggling to make sense of decisions that account for time horizons beyond the next political term or fiscal budget. Governments will need to develop strategies that break the tragedy of the horizon and guide deep structural transformation towards long-termism. Moreover, the dynamic and linked nature of these long emergencies will require the government to enable actors in society to play their part in mitigating the impact and affecting positive change. A national development strategy needs to be designed in such a way that it can retain relevance and effectiveness over the long term. It will be important to foster learning, resilience, and structural capabilities for a legitimate, investable, and agile response. We've developed a framework that addresses the strategic shifts required for a way forward. The framework sees us floating on currents of uncertainty that dominate our closely entangled world. To navigate these currents, we need to see the nation not just as a territorial boundary, but as a system of interconnected flows. A development plan needs to be focused not only on one-to-one action-reaction responses to strategic risks, but as a network approach consisting of a number of parallel processes involving multiple actors and building the capabilities of a nation. We also need to build anti-fragility for the nation. In other words, the capabilities for a nation to thrive in uncertain environments and grow from adversity. The framework looks through the donut model to see the risks and potentials that our current economy is exposing us to, and it helps us to move to a safe zone of operation, where climate and human development needs are met, whilst recognizing the divergent development cycles of different nations. Further, the framework needs to account for the technological advances that our society will experience and propel us upwards on the spiral to explore the integrated potential of our human, machine, and ecological development. For that, we need to embrace a new thesis of deep growth. This thesis recognizes our simultaneous need to degrow our material economy whilst making it circular, grow our intangible economy, and regenerate our foundational biosystems. This future cannot be delivered by one actor alone. We need to build a more inclusive democracy, and one in which we act as custodians for future generations. It requires a level of citizen participation that can drive collaborative rather than centralized innovation. Consequently, we need a deployment framework building horizontal strategies and collaborative capabilities based on iterations of societal scale sense-making, future imagining, decision-making, experimenting, and learning. These will continuously feed back into each other and embed lessons learned along the way. This will enable the methodology to address the core of the deep code operating throughout our systems and the transformation required to achieve their potential. The uncertainty and complexity inherent in transition presents a challenge for development strategies that aim to set defined objectives within set timeframes. We propose that a national development strategy should not be a static document written once, but a living instrument, updated in real time. It should not set out a concrete plan, but a list of aims to be achieved through flexibility. It should not be written by the government alone, but through a quadruple helix process, bringing together civil society, academia, and business. It should not look at a country in isolation, but as a system and what connections a country can build with the world. It should continuously measure success and risk indicators. It should not attempt to maximize what we think is possible today, but to enable us to realize what we did not know that we could achieve. The transition requires not only new innovative policy, but a transformation of the machinery of government. It requires new institutions, new ways of financing, an acceleration towards digital and analytical capability, and the building of new capabilities, not only across government, but also society, and in a way that disseminates learning. It's then that the government can enable the whole of society to meet the future and the scale of adaptation required, and not with fear, but with renewed optimism to truly build back better.
I hope you enjoyed that. That inspirational and I think very different way of thinking about national development that we saw highlighted in the video. Now, we'll move to the first discussion, which will focus on how change happens in uncertainty. And over to a dear partner and friend, Hoa-Binh Adjemian, Head of Sector Economic Development in Digital Eastern Partnership countries, to set us up and introduce the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you, and great to have you today. So I have the honor to animate a panel with 4 distinguished guests. I mean, all different but complementary one to another. Not to duplicate the introduction, but we have a policymaker, Deputy Prime Minister of North Macedonia, and we've just seen the work you've been doing. We have Duncan Green, an activist, a writer, a professor, and thinking about change. We have a CEO of a NASDAQ-traded company, but also a philanthrope heavily involved in Armenia and growth in rural Armenia. We have the CEO of the European Initiative on Climate Innovation, and so all of you are welcome, and let's engage in a discussion for us working as civil servant in both DigiNear and UNDP to better do a job and to be better actor of change. So, if you allow me, let me start with Deputy Prime Minister Fatmir Bichi. I mean, welcome and thanks a lot for the honor to have joined. We've just seen a video of the new strategy, the way you want to engage in North Macedonia. I think it's very exciting. It shows there's a lot of hope behind your strategy. But for us working in different countries, could you please tell us how this strategic framework, I mean, what you've been building and thinking and the vision you have for North Macedonia, this framework, how is it different from the traditional approach? And what institutional setup do you have to put in place to better navigate the complexity and the uncertainty of we are facing and you are facing in the Republic of North Macedonia? Fatmir, please.
Thank you. Can we hear each other? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. First,
Perfect.
as I said, it is our pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce first why actually we decided in such time to talk about long-term plans because mainly different countries talk on how they accelerate and how they cope with the crisis such as COVID-19 and how they will use the opportunity in post-COVID period instead of thinking long-term. First, we have actually realized that there are certain uncertainty and coming from the fact that if the government or if the country doesn't have a long-term vision, that actually it enables all different actors to plan accordingly and act accordingly. Secondly is that we do have as a country ahead of us several challenges. One is the Agenda 2030. The second is the EU accession process, with whom I think all of you are very, very familiar, but as well other challenges that are national but global challenges as well, like climate change and the others. On the other side, we realize that there is enhanced regional complexities, both on the issue of how we deal with the crisis, such as COVID, previously, which was a health economic crisis as well. But on the other side, we did realize that there is a plurality of strategic documents in place within the country, action plans within the public institution and society, which many of them overlaps, contradicts, and creates a certain mess actually in not only at the governing side, but in general among different stakeholders. And therefore, we decided that instead of just speaking what's wrong and why it has been wrong, let's start to create a certain methodology, which might be a methodology, first of all, quite inclusive, because that's something that we have seen, that investing in inclusivity in the planning phase, in the planning stage, actually enables you to have a consensus and agreement for the implementation phase. Therefore, actually, we used quite a lot of time on investing in methodological approach to build in a collaborative process between local, international expertise, but civil society, business, and academia as such. We wanted three main core principles to be reflected in the methodology for the national development strategy. The first was that the strategy should be a living document. It should not be a document that will be on the tables of the decision makers only, but it should be a living document. We wanted to move away from creating a static document and a document that aimed towards a dynamic one that will offer flexibility and agility. Something that we trusted is vital for a strategy whose lifespan is around 20 years. Secondly, we wanted to create an environment in which actually we will enable all parties, all stakeholders, important one for the society, to be part of the first, as I said at the beginning, of the developing of the strategy, but as well on monitoring and implementing the strategy. And we call it quadruple helix. Because actually what we have seen in the past in North Macedonia, but it's more or less in most of the countries, either in Southeast Europe, but as well in some countries of European Union, it has been that the government have created such midterm and long-term documents. So we said, no, we abandoned that. It's not the government, the one the only actor that has to build the document as such, but there are others to be involved. And as you saw in the video, actually, it was thought that the quadruple helix will work between the government, civil society, organizations, academia, and the business community. We embedded as well innovation as a core component of the formulation of the strategy and how we are going to test its implementation and monitoring. And lastly, Before going to the final point, complementarity of the national development strategy with the EU agenda and other key strategic documents and goals of the country was something that we wanted to integrate. So it's a not standalone document floating somewhere, but it's a document that lives together and creates a complementarity as such. And finally, we believe that the challenges of our society are facing are too complex and interconnected to be tackled in isolation. So we adopted a so-called systems approach to solving them. One of the ways in which this approach translates to our strategy is that we will focus on identifying interconnected risks and potentials for the country over a time horizon using the donut framework, which is developed by Kate Raworth, and use it actually to build societal capabilities, because we do think that the only way to move forward is, as you implement certain things, is learn throughout the processes and create capabilities to be able to accept different challenges coming to in reality. And moreover, what we actually introduced with the national development strategy, actually, it's not that we were and we started talking on the importance of the document as such to be created, but we do see it as a process, and national development strategy and should be seen as a process, as a long-term process in which we have embedded quite a lot of things, because there should be a change in the approach, in the mindset of people, in order to be able to cope with the challenges of growth as a country in all different perspectives.
So thanks a lot, Deputy Prime Minister. Very, very interesting. I think the your explanation coming after the video of prepared that you prepared really makes the point, and I really take note of what you're saying. That a strategy is not a document, because we all have read many strategies, and you stress this rightly. It's a process, and the importance of changing of mind. Let's jump into and we'll come back to you if you allow me, Fatmir. Let's move to Duncan. Duncan, you're an activist, you're a professor, you wrote a book on how change happened, a book that I nearly finished, that I really enjoy. I mean, so you are not only an actor of change, but you're quite involved in the theory of change. You know that sometimes institutions like EU and EU, UNDP and others, we adopt a fashionable language. I mean, we focus on the language, or we focus on the document, as the Deputy Prime Minister was saying, and we don't focus on the process. You talk about rule of thumb. So what could you tell us, not to summarize the book in 5 minutes, because we don't have time, and that might be for another time, but what advice would you give to policymakers, whether in civil society or in government or international institution, to make sure that we don't just adopt a new language, but we would truly embrace uncertainty and advance in what is a complex world? Duncan.
Thanks, Marvin, and thanks, Deputy Prime Minister. That was a great introduction. Said quite a lot of the things I was going to say, which frees up some time for other things. One of the things I've noticed in academia is that people adopt this language just to try and look clever. So you get a lot of people saying, this is a systems issue, this is all about complexity. And then they just say what they would have said anyway, but they just think it makes them sound clever. And I think what's interesting is to actually focus on what you're focusing on in this panel, which is, what do you do differently if you take this stuff seriously? And I'll give you a few thoughts, some of which echo what the Deputy Prime Minister just said. So it's a bit, I think metaphors are very useful in discussing complexity in systems. And for me, I'm a keen cyclist. And when I ride across London on my bicycle, I think a lot about complexity, because I think if I set out a classic linear aide plan for my route on a bicycle, with speed and direction at each point in that route set out in advance, I would die before I got about 100 meters, because traffic is a classic complex system. And in order to survive as a cyclist, you need to constantly have real-time feedback. And you have to be able to respond to that real-time feedback. It's not just enough to have it. The front cover of The Economist this week was talking about a new brand of economics which uses real-time data and responds immediately to real-time data rather than 3-6 month delays before GDP figures come out. Or, sorry, I'm not allowed to say GDP in the company of Kate Rayworth, but you know what I mean, that kind of thing. So feedback and the ability to adapt real-time to that feedback is first point. Second point, all plans are provisional. I really like what Dr. Bitchie said about we don't want strategies to die on a shelf. They have to be a living document. I would go a bit further, actually. I think you have to plan for the unplannability. You have to plan for the uncertainty. You have to say in 3 months, in 6 months, we will have a strategy testing session where everybody's allowed to stand back, critique what they've been doing for the previous 3 months, a safe space, and then revise. And I think also that comes down to rules of thumb. I'll talk about that in a minute. Third point, one of the issues about complex systems and uncertainty is we don't know the answers. And if we think we know the answers, we probably shouldn't be there. And one of the ways around that lack of knowledge is working much more in terms of coalitions, multi-stakeholder initiatives. You bring in a diversity of viewpoints, you're more likely to find useful solutions. You're more likely to be interesting, innovative, resilient. It's hard. Working in coalitions is not a lot of fun. If anybody in academia has tried to be interdisciplinary, it makes your brain hurt. So these things are not, it's easy to say, very hard to do, but there's really no alternative. And a bigger point on that, I think, is thinking about ecosystems rather than projects. So you need to think about the enabling environment. If you can't pick the winner, if you can't pick the startup that's going to succeed, then if you're in government, how do you create the enabling environment for these unknown startups to have a better chance? So it's much more about that, the ecosystem rather than the particular plant that you want to plant and make flourish. And then final 2 points, this question of rules of thumb. I honestly fear that civil servants making decisions on a daily basis are not even going to consult the living document. They're going to work on the basis of heuristics, rules of thumb. And we need to know that those rules of thumb are aligned with that living document, with that strategy. Rules of thumb in Oxfam would be, can we raise money for this? Does this take gender into account? Is this an inequality issue? Each organization has its own, often implicit, unexpressed rules of thumb. And I found it very interesting working with different organizations to get them to make them explicit and see if everyone has the same ones. Because if not, that will explain a lot of the difference and division within institutions who are trying to do good things. And on that point, incentives really matter. I think the only way that you're going to move the needle and get to these kind of new innovative systems, if people in HR, if people in finance, if people in the bits that aren't in these policy discussions get it and do it, because they have huge capacity to frustrate clever ideas from policy people if you don't bring them on board. And that's one of the big things I've seen in the aid business is that lots of people in the program teams have had really interesting discussions about adaptive management and doing development differently. And then the HR people or the finance people just stop it happening because they haven't been included in those discussions. So that last point, it has to be a whole of institution approach. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Duncan, for this rule of thumb. And I really take note that, and I will reflect on it and the fact that most of the time we refer to our rules of thumb in our own institution rather than the policy document. It's so right. Garo, we really honored to have you here today. You're managing innovation. You created a biotech company. You created a biotech company that now is traded on the NASDAQ. And you run it as a CEO. In addition to your philanthropy, well, we can talk about it in another and the second round of question. If the core of your business is to innovate, if I understand correctly, your company is working on cancer vaccine, is really on the top of the innovation in the sector of finding cures to cancer. What's your rule of thumb? How do you ensure that an organization as your company allows inclusion of ideas, in particular when it's probably built with a lot of expertise? I imagine that most of the people working in your company have all PhD postdocs, so they're all really knowledgeable. So how do you ensure at the same time to have this knowledge and to create innovation for us in the policy sphere to be inspired by the work you're doing? Garo.
Thank you very much, Ben, and our distinguished panel, Deputy Prime Minister Duncan and Kristen. I think there's commonality in what we're saying and what we're talking about. I have an addiction, and my addiction is when there is a need for something, I'm addicted to pull together the means of addressing that need. And I think you and I have talked, Ben, about the fact that we started the biotech company, Agenus, many years ago, based on the fact that there was a need to cure cancer, and the current methodologies were not working. And when I say current methodologies were not working, typical methods of treating cancer at that time, and still to some extent, was based on chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and none of these methods were really pleasant for the patient who was undergoing the difficulties of cancer. Now, on the other hand, as you remarked, when we started Children of Armenia Fund, based on a trip that I had taken to Armenia, and identified the need in Armenia at the time in the rural villages, which was the consequence of the system having collapsed. And when I say collapse, I'm talking about a total collapse. And of course, the needs of the people were complex. And similarly, current methodologies to deal with it, and this was in 2003, were not working, because had they worked, people would not have been in the predicament that we discovered them. So with that identification of the need, if one feels the confidence, the courage, I think courage is very important, to be able to tackle the issues, of course, the most important thing to do at that time was to pull together the right team. You talked, Ben, about, we have PhDs and experts in our biotech company. Important for them to be like-minded, to be able to work together with trust, respect, and love. Very important. And then remarkable things happen. Similarly, in the Children of Armenia Fund, we had to assemble. We started from nothing. In both cases, we assembled a team of people that were like-minded, that would respect each other and have a love of what they're doing. And so a lot of the remarks that were made about innovation is critical, because if we apply stale methods to solving complex problems, that never works. So innovation and a sense of urgency to do things, and of course, the quality with which you do things become paramount to the ultimate success. And in Armenia, for example, we discovered that the situation, in spite of the fact that we would like to simplify things, and we still do, by the way, situation was complex, because it wasn't just about education, it wasn't about just healthcare, it wasn't about social systems and economic development. It was all of the above. All of the above. And unless you have a holistic way of addressing these issues, it will be difficult to address them. So we started with one problem, and then that grew into addressing it with the inclusion of other needs. And so here we are, a holistic method of addressing complicated problems. And of course, the values that you impart onto people become critical. They have to trust you. You have to trust them and respect them. There's an organization called GAP International, which is a consultancy for corporate executives. And one of the things that they promote is discovering the genius in everyone. So I think Duncan and the Prime Minister, you made a comment about the fact that we cannot have biases, or at least the comment was in that regard. You can't have biases going into solving a problem. I think you have to be open-minded. You have to include the constituencies that you're dealing with. You have to respect their genius, because if you come in with sort of McDonald's kind of solutions to every single problem, it doesn't work. Customization is critical. And that's what we do as an organization, and that's what we do in our quest to cure cancer, because every patient's disease is different. Even though it's cancer, it's different. Every community's problems are different. Even within Armenia, by the way, when we discover that from one region to another, the problems are complex. And so customization is critical, and of course, inclusion. I think, Mr. Prime Minister, you talked about the inclusiveness, the importance of inclusiveness. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure that we will have a lively discussion.
Thanks a lot, Garo. Kirsten, you're the CEO of EU-MEN Climate Innovation. You're involved in many cities and in Europe in what you call demonstration project, and maybe you tell us more about it. You talk about orchestrating change. I think your a background check about Climate Kick shows the extent of your work you've been doing. But maybe let's focus on something in particular. Garo was saying customization is critical. Everyone agrees before that we have to be this inclusive, open, agile organization or system to respond to complexity. But in your work, Kirsten, how do you move to how do you manage the tension between the need to customize and the need to scale up? Because unless we scale up and we find solution we will not tackle the climate change issue. So how do you see it? How do you live it? And how do you lead your team in this tension of customizing, doing beautiful, deep demonstration project, but at the same time aiming at changing the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you all for the opportunity to join this conversation and contribute to the discussion. Perhaps let me respond immediately let me respond indirectly, actually, with a little explanation of what those famous deep demonstrations are and how they work, because I think that is probably the best possible way of describing how to address the relationship between local specificity and local contextual needs, and the opportunity and the need to scale and to find ways of doing more with less and quicker with as much as we can throw at the complexity and uncertainties that we face. So when we're describing, I'd very much want to build and recognize Duncan's observations about the importance of planning for the unplannable and using heuristics and incentives and methodological, practical tools and mechanisms to make it possible to create a coherent relationship between what we're doing with innovation in cities and the nature of the changes we are seeking to achieve and to learn about with innovation. So we, as EIT Climate Kick, working with cities and working in long-term deep partnership with city governments, so with public administration, with decision makers from the mayor or right through the civic administration, but also into the organizations that are often owned or part owned by the city that are part of delivering city functions, with local communities, with neighborhoods and streets, and with SMEs, micro SMEs, with businesses and industry. So really working with a full community of actors who are part of the challenge owner space of a city transformation, and similar in land use as well. one of the key questions about in terms of how is to start by fully recognizing that we don't know how to do this, that we are talking about really dramatic transformation in a scale of time that is beyond any of our experience. In any form of problem solving, we have never had to fundamentally, structurally change almost every aspect of the way in which we live in urban contexts and move about and assume our kind of life should be, at the scale and at the pace we need, and in such a way that it is meaningful to local contexts. So a lot of this is about deliberately shifting our understanding and our ask of innovation. So shifting from our perspective as practitioners, shifting from expecting innovation to provide us with answers, to using and designing and deploying innovation to help us learn and accelerate as quickly as possible our experiential engagement with possibilities for change, real grounded possibilities in streets, in communities, around parks, in roads, in infrastructure, in water waste, in rural land or in kind of urban wastelands and abandoned land. In order to go through that process, that really makes it very important for us to work on intent, to understand, and not objectives, but agree around an intent to transform and understand that that intent is the kind of, it's partly about a space that can contain the heuristics, the rule of thumb that Duncan was referring to, that it's also about containing something that is simple enough and bold enough to carry through political cycles and relevant enough to the context of global needs, national needs, regional needs, or multi-regional or local needs. Second is to try and really understand and frame up, acknowledge we're dealing with multiple problem spaces that are all interconnected and interdependent. They're inherently complex. They ask of us to come up with complex, multifaceted, multi-sided solutions and to work with multiple actors and engage with them. So that means structuring something like a portfolio that is very deliberately acknowledging that any of the innovation solutions we try on the ground are going to be partial and fragmented. And those solutions will help us learn what might be most meaningful for a particular context and not so useful for others, and what from other solutions through processes of reconnaissance can we draw in and connect and engage with into specific contexts and learn about the relationship of usefulness, utility, and of meaning that is inherent in that tension that you were asking about in terms of local and scalable. A portfolio gives you a framework for learning. It gives you literally a framework within which you can plug, you can activate multiple different innovation solutions simultaneously. You can connect them into different acupuncture points around what you're trying to engage with, whether it's social change or fiscal incentives or maps, mental maps and images of what a community looks like, or technology solutions that people get more and more excited about. But it requires us to then have a very, very systematic process of sense making that is really trying to understand through the eyes of those working and delivering on particular innovation projects, what's the relationship between this one and that other one? How might we consider combining some of these elements together into a bigger, more composite solution that deals with many different dimensions of problems we've never thought about dealing with together? Some of them, for example, are needing to handle both reduction of carbon emissions in, say, building structures and adaptation to very, very different climate conditions like heat and water scarcity or massive storms or winds. So needing to think about the way in which we bring solutions together to do multiple things at once. And that kind of sense making, that sort of patient interrogation, what are we learning, what are we seeing, what are the obstacles, what's unexpected, what is that project actually discovering is possible, what's missing, what else is happening over there that could be relevant, that helps us build up from the experience and extract from the innovation experience decision support that can then inform. We need to change fiscal assumptions here, fiscal habits, planning, procedures, procurement, policies around financing, policies around safety regulations, or underpinning narratives around what good or meaningful looks like or what well-being looks like in this particular context, supporting that kind of policy planning approach. And what we find is that very often the structures of change are applicable to multiple contexts, where structures are often referring to a shift in underpinning assumptions about need, about sufficiency, or about expectation, or about wealth or prosperity, or about the opportunity to combine things like digital infrastructure that can be useful for energy efficiency, but also useful for community care and social mobility and aged care or healthcare in homes. We often find that the relationship between what's specific locally and what's scalable is a kind of this is a percentage relationship. So 70% is scalable, 30% is inherently specific to context and culture, and structuring a portfolio to make that part of the heuristic, make that part of your interrogation and your inquiry and your choice making on what innovations to introduce into different cities is a really important way of recognizing that relationship. And often it's about adaptive capacity. So the ability of and the introducing, for example, trees as infrastructure or metropolitan or an urban forest, where there is a set of things that are structural, that are based on design principles, that have inherent adaptive capacities that can be used in many contexts and can be used like fractals to kind of talk to each other and scale up and scale down, and other elements that really are about local feedback loops and local narratives or senses of self, or community engagements, the questions around social inclusion or use of physical spaces to work with different recreational or sporting or industrial needs. So I think it's really about designing for complexity, designing for multivalent, multiple properties, multiple possibilities, and designing in to the way in which we use innovation to help us learn what's possible in specific contexts. The idea that some of those principles might be communicable, might be contagious in a positive sense, and might be useful in other contexts. And then you have that as an inquiry that is part of the innovation process itself. So I'll stop there. I know I'm saying a lot. Very, very pleased to continue to be part of the conversation.
Thanks a lot. Before we continue with the discussion, just for the participants, please, if you have any question, put them in. I'm sure there's a way to write question on this platform, and then we'll filter them and ask them to the different panelists. We had this. Garo was talking about values. I mean, and Kirsten, you were talking about way to learn the solution. I would like to hear more, and as I'm reading your book, Duncan, about the different qualities, and you were saying in your book, we should have the curiosity, the humility, and the reflexivity, as if we want to be actor of change or support innovation. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Sure, thanks. So I think there's a real challenge here, which is it's very easy to be one thing, which is to be curious, to endlessly learn, and not to actually do anything. Sometimes my colleagues in Oxfam get very annoyed with me because I'm always asking questions and saying, "But what about this and what about that?" And they talk about analysis paralysis, where you're just where you're endlessly curious. And so it's how do you balance intent, the kind of thing that Garo was talking about a solution that you're going to throw everything at, with humility. Because we've got a sort of perhaps an internalized view of leadership, which is, follow me, I have the answer. And that can be quite seductive. And it's quite hard to say, follow me, I have no idea where I'm going, is a much more difficult sell in terms of leadership and in terms of organizing a group of people around you. So I think there's some real tensions between these ideas, but I don't see we have much choice but to try and balance them. Kirsten, how do you get people to follow you when you say, I have no idea where we're going?
Well, I certainly don't start by saying I've got the answer. That would be extremely unwise. No, I think so. Our experience, I was also thinking about, we really are working a lot with public administration or with governments at all sorts of different scales. And my experience is starting from the beginning in looking together at the nature of change, of the nature of what it would take to change, kind of really looking together at what I would probably call a problem space, but the language is irrelevant. It's just looking together at the enormity of what we actually need to do. And gradually beginning to piece into it, to storytell into it, to find ways of inquiring into it, to explore, to look at existing things and interrogate and explore what are those things, how much of this are those things working on, what are they assuming about a future world or the present world, and when you get to the edges of those assumptions, what's there? You know, the kind of notion of here be dragons, what's out there? How would we take a small boat and set off into those uncharted waters and start working on things? But embedding and working on that process from the very beginning, in our experience, more and more draws people in around the desire. It triggers that problem-solving desire. It triggers the desire to solve. Then the challenge is how to not run straight to solutions and try and grab whatever you can to throw at the problem, but hold that space to explore, and to start to explore how could we activate ways of experimenting to learn, and activate ways of designing, making choices together to learn, and activate ways of designing participatory decision-making and governance together to learn. But it's an inductive process, and it's inherently creative, and it's inherently exploratory, and that does somehow reinforce a sense of positive reinforcement and interest and curiosity, and it's much more generative than the kind of, my God, we're running out of time, we need a roadmap, and then there's just this big implementation gap between a roadmap and reality.
Maybe, Kirsten, is the sense of urgency you were talking about, Garo, and before we take the question from the audience, maybe as we have someone from the financial sector, how do you take, Garo, this vision of us policymakers building portfolio of intervention? I imagine for someone in your sector and trying medicines, it should be more natural. But how do you see the complementarity and or the lack of portfolio and risk taking in the public sector?
I think,
or the difficulty we have. What's your take on that?
I think these are the core issues that you're talking about, Ben, because when you talk about policymakers, there's a tendency to apply non-customized solutions to problems that require customization. And I think, for example, if you have an experience in Africa and then you come up with a solution and try to apply that solution to India, the system fails. And I think we need to really be open-minded, as some of our participants are talking about. When there is an issue, the why do we need to address the issue is probably the simplest of the three variables that we need to consider here. The why is easy. The what is a little bit more complicated. That requires customization. But of course, the most complicated is what the Deputy Prime Minister was talking about, and what one of the introductory comments by Ben Slay talked about. He mentioned how many times. How is the most complicated. And I think the how requires experience and understanding of the real life situations. We're talking about, for example, addressing things in real time. In many battles that have been fought around the world, the winners are always those that adapt to the immediate solutions that are required in real time in the front line most readily. So adaptation based on the observation of the real life situations is key. Now, when you talk about the speed with which things need to be done, of course, many of the problems that we encounter are problems where the situation is deteriorating. It's not stable. And so when you look at a situation that is deteriorating, you need to address it immediately. If you don't, then the problems will become more complicated. Like, for example, in Armenia, we saw that the first world people living in third or fourth world conditions were horrible, because that meant that people that were first world would decline into becoming second, third, fourth world people. And if you didn't address the problem immediately, then the problem would become a lot more complicated tomorrow or the day after. So speed is critical, innovation is critical, and of course, the quality with which you do things is critical. And if we don't do it, then we have bigger problems in the future. So I think between the public sector and the private sector, we need to bend together, be open-minded, and as I think, Kirsten, you mentioned that if we go into a problem with a fixed solution or a conviction that we have the solution, it won't work. It will not work. So that open-mindedness and collaborative effort, trusting relationship between the different constituencies is really key to our success ultimately.
There was a question from the audience, and if we talk about learning, we talk about feedback loop. I mean, processes of listening and fine-tuning and having what Fabien was saying, a living document. How in practice do we have feedback loop? And maybe I'll ask to the three of you, I mean, Duncan, as an activist, I mean, you've been working on different campaigns. How do you get the feedback when you're so excited by a campaign, but it's the wrong angle, it doesn't work, it doesn't lead to nowhere? Or Kirsten, how do you take negative feedback when you implement a deep demonstration project? Or Garo, same thing, about a medicine, you put millions in a medicine and you have to stop it. I'm sure it's the same story. At one point, you have to stop. So maybe we start with Duncan because he didn't speak. And feedback loop, okay. Negative. And if Fadmir, you manage to connect, then the later the better in a way, because we really want to hear your experience. But no, it's not working still. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we'll just ad lib until the Deputy Prime Minister can get back on the line, I think. So I think it's quite difficult I think it's probably difficult in NGOs. I suspect it's difficult everywhere. Engineers Without Borders, which is a great NGO, set up a website where people could bring their failures and discuss them in detail. And of course, no one came because people don't like doing that. So if you're going to have a situation where you can not just have people bigging themselves up, which happens a lot in the NGOs, and I suspect a lot everywhere, but you want to you need to create a safe space where it's okay to say, this isn't working, or even to tell your colleagues that what they're doing isn't working. That takes some construction because it's quite countercultural in many organizations to be that critical and to say those kind of things. And unless you do that, you will just carry on doing what you started doing because no one has the honesty to say, I've got some doubts about this, and have we actually asked the people we're supposed to be helping? So the other question is, who's in the room when you have these conversations? Because it's no good just having the people who originally thought of it, because they're always going to think it's great. You've got to have people in different parts of the system feeding back and saying, well, actually, this completely unintended thing has started happening now because of what you're doing, so you need to change it. So but I don't think you can do that continuously because it's quite demobilizing, demotivating for people. It's about creating these moments every few months, every few weeks or whatever, where it's okay to have that conversation and is valued.
Okay, so maybe if I build on that and answer, I see there's a question in the chat on explaining how local feedback loops are working, and I'll build on this question also. When are they positive? When are they negative? When are they both? Because actually, for me, it's like a little bit AC. You know, it's an alternative current. They're going in both directions all of the time. Actually, we use a language of sense making. I know the UNDP is also using a protocol around sense making to describe the same kind of activity, which is really an activity of hermeneutical inquiry, of kind of interrogation, of meaning making, of meaning building, knowledge building, meme making, kind of finding structures and patterns and looking into the experience of something that is happening live. So let me take an example of cities that we're working with within a Western European or North or Southern European context, where we are working with a city, for example, to look at, as I said, look at the intent to transform, take on, and really begin to understand the enormity of that, and understand it as something holistic, the whole city, not just whatever sector needs to change or whatever sector we're told that climate roadmaps or policies need to address, but the living reality, messy, gritty, colourful life of a real city, and then looking at that together and both examining and embracing where are there existing initiatives that when you start to pull them together into a more comprehensive systemic perspective, you can see how they map onto ways in which a city thinks and functions. And I would thoroughly recommend, for example, I know this is going to sound very academic, but it's actually very practically useful just as a set of heuristics and rules of thumb, reading something like Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life and the relationship between the formal structures of a city and its informal life, and thinking about innovation designed to respond to that. And so then looking for existing initiatives, how can they be recast so that they start to engage with more dimensions of possibilities for change or more dimensions of what needs or could be shifted, and bringing in other initiatives around them. And then the inquiry of active learning and constructing of feedback loops is engaging with the reality of those projects. What is happening with this particular initiative in, for example, Amsterdam, the Green Light District, where the Red Light District is trying to experiment with turning itself into a zero carbon emissions engagement site with buildings that are actively seeking to either decarbonize or even go beyond and regenerate. But at the same time, there are experiments with the night sector and the community that usually is inhabiting and working within the red light district. Or how do we engage with Metropolitan Forest in Madrid, where we begin to understand how does that relate to questions of mass migration, mass refugees, with social tensions and cohesion in parts of the city that is in industrial lands or industrial in-between zones. How do we think about it drawing in agroforestry and so on? The feedback loops then become very practical ways of inquiring into possibility, into properties, into combinations, and also inquiring into resistance. You know, we had a project in Birmingham with electric vehicles, and where the most problematic issue to deal with was that the cars just kept being vandalized. They were put into housing estates, into social housing. They were installed there with a hypothesis around the fact that this would support and make easy, free, accessible, zero carbon mobility, exciting, beautiful cars. And the consistent pattern of vandalization signaled, most importantly, a complete failure to understand on behalf of the entire initiative, how would you need to design for that in a way that had the community opting and choosing or even beginning to think about what was going on. But most important, the stakeholders that had been left out, local taxi drivers and Uber drivers who were intensely resistant to the idea of anything that took away livelihood, and were working and living and often resident in part of those same social housing areas. So a lot of it is around, in our experience, again, really structuring systematic inquiry and supporting systematic inquiry as two-way loops. This is not about kind of do a thing, pull out a feedback and do something else with it, but create it as a constant dialogue, a dialectic of exchange on possibility, on appetite, on unexpected outcomes and unexpected interdependencies, and then gradually layer in the meaning and the decision support and the what can we do with this, what do we need to learn here and there. And that layering, the idea that usefulness, how you use innovation to support choices on development changes and on policy changes and on transformational options, is not ever going to come in neat parcels of information that say it's just this. It's going to come in constant strata that you add up and you work with and engage with at every point. And I think the last reflection is how to hold the will to live and to keep doing that kind of work when it's long, it's patient, it's complex, and it doesn't necessarily add up to neat answers and neat implementation pathways. Partly that's about really investing in building capability in those who are holding this kind of work at every level within public administration, within communities, within businesses and SMEs, and explicitly building capability in systems thinking, but also in sense making. Some of it's about building capability in impact frameworks and looking for impact frameworks that are much more structurally adapted to the kind of live learning by doing. And some of it is about creating amplification mechanisms, making it clear for governments that what is happening here is part of a broader directional signal, whether it's the European missions or the Green Deal or interregional, intergovernmental agreements that legitimize the effort of persisting?
Oh,
I think I'm back.
thanks a lot.
Finally.
You're back. It's great you were able to navigate or dance in this complexity and welcome you back. So you heard three amazing speakers.
Yeah, you see that the public administration.
We want to hear your reaction.
No, but this shows that public administration can adapt. Actually, we swift with another computer and we solve the problem. No, actually, I wanted to say, first, I'm really happy that I could actually hear all the intervention of the other panelists, and I cannot more than what they said agree. But there is an essential one thing that will answer your question, how the public administration actually will accept the challenge to learn, adapt, increase the capabilities. And that's the core value or the principle, and that's the ownership over the process. This is what we are actually trying to impose into the national development strategy development, and actually create not only among the external stakeholders, but inside the stakeholders, the public servants, public administration as such, to create the ownership over the process, because we do believe that that's the core of understanding how they actually have to change in order to answer to the demand from the citizens or other stakeholders in the society in creating and enabling better environment, whatever it is. Either it is a startup ecosystem or other ecosystems which have to be in place. And that's, I think, the core and the uniqueness of how I'm convinced and believe that the public administration will positively react on.
No, thanks so much, and really happy that you could hear and to hear your reaction, and very excited by the way you plan and this living document. I mean, for North Macedonia. Maybe we coming nearly to an end to the panel. I mean, but let's go for one more round. And the objective of us meeting here today was also to help fostering a different way of working, us as civil servant, because you're talking to civil servants, maybe not civil servant in North Macedonia, but civil servants supporting partner country, enlargement and neighborhood countries of the European Union. What would be your advice to help us better grasp this uncertainty, embrace uncertainty, as some people would say, and better be actor of change? We could start maybe by Professor Duncan, because you're Professor Analysis, so asking a question of advice is probably part of your everyday work.
Yeah, but always echoing what Kirsten said about not actually knowing the answers, right? So I think one of the things for if you're in this situation is to find which sectors or adjacent sectors which look a bit like yours have tried this more, have gone further ahead. And for me, in my world, which is the aid sector, there's a bunch of really interesting work going on around institutional reform. So this is, how do you improve tax collection? How do you improve respect for rights? All sorts of things around this general topic of institutional reform. And there's some jargon there which you have to get past. But if you just Google on adaptive management, thinking and working politically, doing development differently, there's a lot of really interesting case studies in many countries. I've looked at some of them funded by DFID and funded by the Australian Aid Agency. And I think there's some really interesting lessons emerging from there. The question then is, how do those are those lessons and how are those approaches going to spread to much bigger bits of the aid sector like health and education? And I think that's an open question at the moment. But there are some really interesting accidental labs going on in the aid sector, I think, around this stuff. I'm happy to provide links to people if people want to get.
Thanks a lot, mate. No, and your book is amazing. So, but we're not there to advertise anything. Kirsten, maybe in the field of climate change, what would you expect from us civil servants that are covering different sectors, not in particular climate change? I mean, digital economy. How would you want us to be your ally in trying to build this better world?
Well, I think it's helpful for a start. I'm just checking. Okay. I think it's helpful for a start that when I refer to climate change, I'm referring to our chance of survival, really, which pretty much encompasses all aspects of who we are and how we think about our right to live and our way of relating to each other and to our environment. So I think first things first, I would seek to create the conditions and ask of civil servants to join me in not thinking of climate change as a sector or a problem or a job to be done, but a context that is as big as this entire planet on which we live, and a context for a choice that we are making as a set of generations currently involved in decision-making, resource allocation and activity about how many millions of humans will be able to live. Because ultimately we are making a choice whether we can find a different design for life so that 10 billion people can live sustainably and with a decent level of well-being and quality of life on this planet, or whether a lot less people will be able to survive. So for me, that is the nature of it. Whether we call it climate change or we call it something much bigger, my hunch would be call it something much bigger so that we don't get tempted to try and solve for this in sectors and silos, because that's not what we're dealing with. And at that point, I think it is about acknowledging on the one hand, the weight of the sense of responsibility and the way in which that drives onto us a set of uncomfortable emotions, and often actually almost a numbing set of reactions to try and simplify it, to try and make it go away, or to try and deal with it in small parcels, and to instead invest in self, invest in kind of individual education, individual learning experiences, and individual exposure, in teams, within civil administration, in community, in kind of departments, invest across, as I see many cities are in fact now doing. They're formalizing education and formalizing vocational support and training, so that it becomes more of an accepted norm to understand the problem in those terms, to understand the challenge of a lifetime in those terms, and to start to introduce different tools for thinking about this. So that, for example, we think about how can we create alternatives for ourselves to the scarcity thinking that we've grown up on through the Industrial Revolution and through a series of kind of political incentives to think in terms of scarcity thinking. And again, another thing I would suggest reading is a wonderful book about the title is Why Does It Matter So Much to Have Too Little, or something. It's something in that order. And really think about, there are power laws in learning. There are power laws in in coming up with creative solutions, in discovering things, and in discovering the properties of the natural world that we haven't really begun to fully comprehend at all. Creating a formal institutional mandate for doing that for every civil servant currently employed in the next 3-4 generations in every public administration, for making space to acknowledge that we don't know, for making space to acknowledge the human experience of fear and uncertainty when we don't know, and for making space for an institutional mandate to learn, and to explore in a context of not knowing, and to therefore deliberately invest at least some part of public budget in systematic experimentation, systematic inquiry, and systematic engagement. So radical collaboration with multiple actors at all parts, because that actually returns a massive order of magnitude wealth creation, value creation, idea creation, and from that generates energy and hope, and from that is a self-reinforcing loop. We begin to get a sense of how we might solve for this. So I think that's absolutely essential, and probably also acknowledging in that same moment that we're dealing with complexity not as a bug, but as a feature. This is a feature of the world we're living in. In our family lives, we know about it. We're handling it all of the time with ups and downs in terms of stress. If we've got kids, if we've got parents, if we're caring for life in different ways, we're handling multiple things shifting in time and context and relationships and outcomes all the time. We know that, we accept that. So it's a way of thinking about how do we begin to accept that that's what we're dealing with in the jobs that we do. And fundamentally, the last point possibly is to be compassionate, with each other, compassionate with the nature of the challenge we're looking at, and much more integrative in our willingness to think, okay, climate change, well, in that case, I'm going to need to learn about biodiversity, and I'm going to need to learn about regenerative land use, and I'm going to need to learn about social transformation, and I'm going to need to learn about digital and AI, because we're going to need to give that a purpose, which is not in of itself produce an automated world, but produce a regenerative, sustainable world, because I need ultimately to privilege the chance of life and the chance of meaningful life.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, for this word. Garo, you have two hats. You're an entrepreneur, successful, and you're a CEO of a large company, but you're also a specialist of rural development, and you're Children of Armenia. Has a size of, I think, 150 people. You're helping so many villages for so many years. So you have the dual facet. How would you knowing both worlds, the world of trying to bring prosperity to very, very remote places where there's not a lot, and the world of being managing a NASDAQ shared company, what type of advice and what would you tell to civil servant who main work is to support partners, countries, and economies, driving, developing program and portfolio of actions and policies? What would you tell us? And thanks again to have joined the panel.
My pleasure, of course, and I enjoyed the session and a lot of the points that were made. I think if we try to institutionalize, as the speakers have talked about, complex problems, I think that's a recipe for failure. So how do the institutions deal with it? And I think the way to do that is to defer to the specialists that have knowledge of the individual situations. For example, with our programs, when I started the foundation in 2003, the first thing we did was to really assemble a townspeople in a town hall meeting. And this was a village of about 3,000 people. And in our first town hall meeting, we assembled over 500 people who felt respected, who felt loved, and who felt that they had something to contribute. So we started with that. And as a result of our efforts over the years, we became specialists in identifying local problems, including people in the solutions of those problems. That's very critical. And as a result, now we have assembled knowledge in over 100 communities. Each one, of course, has its own nuances, but there's a wonderful book, since Kirsten, you mentioned the book, and I think Duncan is an author, of course. There's a wonderful book called No Rules, Rules. It's a book about Netflix and how Netflix has been able to assemble the best people, the best team together to solve their problems and build one of the most successful companies in the world. So if we go with that concept of assembling the best team of people to make the solution to the problems exciting, so that there is a reward associated with solving the problems, then I think we're on our way to much success. So with inclusivity that the Deputy Prime Minister talked about, and our eye on no rules, of course, and the respect for a curious team who is assembled to solve the problem, we can do wonders. We can do wonderful things in solving problems that we never thought were possible to be solved. It's exciting, I think. It's exciting to go about it in a way that motivates people, and motivates not just the people that are the subjects of the benefit, but also people that will work shoulder to shoulder with them in order to come up with some innovative solutions.
Thanks for this message of hope and this vision, and we started the panel with a very interesting video and an exciting view on a new type of open discussion and vision in North Macedonia. Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, you few words closing this panel that I thought was interesting, maybe on how you see the challenge ahead of you, and what advice you would give to your partners, because UNDP and DGNIR are your partners in this journey. Monsieur Deputy Prime Minister, for the closing remark of the panel.
I would not like to close with a negative approach, but I think that whatever we talked, as I said previously, I fully agree, because the old perspectives probably are full of experiences, positive one. But what we do see as a quite a big challenge, and which might jeopardize the efforts not only of the government, but as well of the quadruple helix that I mentioned in the NDC, is the external factors. And those are the big major steps, like driving efforts of the country towards the EU integration. And if the messages towards the EU integration for the country itself, but as well for the Western Balkans, remain as they are at the moment, I think that might jeopardize a little bit the speed in which different stakeholders will positively react, because the change is done usually if there is a drive forward. If there is no drive, then the speed is not there. And secondly, it's the challenge of different crises that it's obvious ahead of us. As we are moving from one crisis, such as pandemic of COVID-19, we are entering to the energy crisis, and then probably it will have a repercussion towards our efforts on climate change and the determination and then contribution of each country towards it. I think that this would be quite challenging to deal with, and probably here I can not agree more with all the panelists that we have to bring the great minds, no matter if they are local or international, in order to find the right way forward.
Thanks a lot to all four of you to have joined this panel. It was very interesting for us. We take a lot of lessons learned, and I would go for a round of applause, but it doesn't work in our new normal. So let's think it happened, and now I'll give back the floor to Laila. Thanks again to have taken the time. It was for me an amazing moment, and I did enjoy being with you.
Thank you, Ben, and to all the speakers, Deputy Prime Minister, Garo, Kirsten, Duncan, thank you for taking the time. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I always find any time to try to do something innovative, there's always a technical problem, but let me not hold longer. We'll have the next discussion really focus on working on what is the practice of actually working on system transformation, and what are some lessons learned that are emerging from practitioners in this field. This panel will be moderated by Francine Pickup, UNDP resident representative in Serbia. Over to you.
Thank you, Leila, and hello, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be moderating this second panel today, and we have three great panelists who we're going to hear from. We heard in the last panel about, in order to stay relevant and to be useful, we need to embrace complexity and we need to be much more ambitious in what we do. This session, as Leila said, is really about the practice of that and how far have we got actually, and what are we learning from what's been done in operationalizing these new approaches. I was looking through the EU's complexity handbook, and right at the end, Duncan Green just mentioned the importance of analogies, and he talked about cycling through London. There was another helpful analogy that I saw about organizations being like sea walls or salt marshes. And an organization that is a sea wall has very clear boundaries, is very efficient, in this case, stopping the sea from getting to the land. But when the design perimeters are exceeded, when it comes to extreme weather or rising sea levels, the wall breaks. Whereas the salt marsh is able to absorb some of the change and maintain a clear identity and ultimately doesn't break. And so I think, the lesson there is we need to be more like sea marshes than sea walls, salt marshes rather than sea walls. And that kind of argument resonates very strongly, as we've been saying in the last session as well, with COVID, when we understand, when businesses, the governments, people increasingly understand that we can't work with siloed approaches anymore, that things are all interrelated, interdependent, and there is an urgency to act, that countries and individuals can't solve things by themselves and that we need to work together. And similarly, we have, as others mentioned, the overlapping crisis of climate change. We have COP coming up in a number of days. We know what to do, but the question is how, and we see just how difficult getting that political buy-in actually is. The President of the European Commissioner, Ursula von Leyen, said the EU Green Deal is about making systemic modernization across the economy, society, and industry. And then we just heard Kirsten from Climate Kick talk about climate change as a different kind of design for life. That's really what it is, and resisting that sectoral approach. And as the EU and UNDP, we are committed to learning, and this panel today is part of that joint commitment to really share with each other this learning journey and to hear from our panelists today on new directions that we can take. So before I introduce the panel and start the questions, let me just remind you, please do put your questions in the chat box. Also your experiences in the chat box. I know that we have some countries participating from within the EU as well as colleagues from the EU and UNDP. So please share your experiences and put your questions in the chat box and we'll try and answer as many as we can. So let me now turn to our panelists, and I'd like to start with Indy. Indy is an architect. He's the co-founder of Project 00 and Dark Matter Lab. Dark Matter Lab is a field laboratory focused on radically redesigning the bureaucratic and institutional infrastructure of our cities, regions, and towns in a more democratic, distributed, great transition. Indy, you've led one of the first organizations, Dark Matter Lab, to start implementing portfolios of experiments. I think your organization was one of the first to do that, and you've been doing it for a long time now. So can you give us some concrete examples of the way you've implemented this systems transformation approach? how you actually do it, and how it's different from normal ways of working.
Can you hear me? Is that coming across?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, perfectly. Okay. Firstly, I wouldn't claim to be the first. I think there are many other people involved, and this field has been developing over many, many years. So just to say that in a kind of a simple way, I suppose I want to use this moment slightly to. It's been great hearing the conversation up to now. But what's very clear listening to it is that what we're learning, and certainly have learnt over the last 5 years, is several things. So, for example, to retrofit one city, the whole of one city, and this was done with Climate Kick actually and Kirsten's team, to retrofit one city costs about 25 billion. 25 billion, right? To put together an urban forest in Madrid is somewhere in the region of 400 million plus capital. And what's becoming clear is, yes, we can build portfolios and institutions and interventions, but actually there seems to be a fundamental problem in not understanding the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And scale is not a small function. It's not like if we just add a little bit more, it just works a little bit better. What becomes very clear is that 25 billion per city across Europe to retrofit all of Europe, which is what we need to do for climate change, isn't just a factor-fold increasing problem. It's a systemic question about how we resource this transition. So what's becoming clear over all the projects that we're doing is that there are fundamental structural issues that are becoming transparent. And those structural issues, unless we deal with them, actually we can do sample retrofit projects or build an urban forest here and there, and it means nothing. Because actually, when you try to price an urban forest, it's about understanding the value it generates to energy utility companies or water utility companies, or to energy savings. But at the same time, what we've got is those prices, those liabilities aren't priced in the market yet. So we've got a fundamental mispricing of externalities, which is not priced. But if you price that in, most of our utilities and energy companies become unviable. Right? So this is not just a simple game. And this is where I slightly worry in this whole of this conversation that the structural issue is actually very, very critical. So we have currently mispriced value across the whole of our economies, I would argue. Externalities are not priced in. When we start to price them in, actually, I think the S&P, there was a piece of research done that S&P 100, if it priced in social environmental costs, 78% of corporations would go bust, which shows the scale of mispricing in our society. Right? And that means that I think we need to be thinking much more structurally about the problems. And I think the structure side is not just resourcing. So how do we resource the story? And too often the conversation is, oh, we need private finance. And the reality is we're talking about 4.5 trillion a year minimum required to deal with this transition. The scale of money that's required and the scale of resource allocation that's required is more equivalent to war than it is to any form of nice, normal transition. And I want to put this in real terms, right? So Glasgow produces 8,000 tons, or not produces, sequesters 8,000 tons of carbon a year, right? In its nature-based solutions, existing nature-based solutions. The Iceland facility for carbon capture captures about 8,000 tons as well. The new facility for carbon capture, which is put together. How much do you think Glasgow produces in carbon? It's about 1.5 million tons of carbon a year. Our solution domain and our problem domain are out of kilter. And what worries me is that we're talking like it's a smooth transition. And actually, it's not a smooth transition. I think we're facing real structural challenges at the level of, I think most of the products that we make are not real. So when we talk about the Bauhaus, why that's really equivalent is that we almost have to re-engineer pretty much all of our product economy in a fundamental way. It's not a smooth transition. You can talk about a built environment, you can talk about energy systems. There are structural issues on hand. So basically the last 5 years has taught me that actually it's a structural issue. And we're pushing everything down on the product side. But actually, unless we start to really understand those liabilities are invisibly accruing on all of us at a fundamental level. And it's not just finance, it's about how we as a society makes decisions. We are not able to make decisions right now, societal decision making. our democratic structures are fundamentally not able to make decisions. There is no doubt IPCC report 5, 4, all have made the case for why we needed to have 1.5 degrees. But societally, we are struggling to make decisions. So our societal decision-making structures are fundamentally broken. And unless we start to accept that our current democratic frameworks, which are built for a predictable industrial age, are not able to make societal decisions, we won't be able to transform. And it's also clear that our democracies don't actually have the mechanisms to transform themselves. So the German constitution doesn't have the mechanism to transform itself systemically into a different framework. And that's true for many, many parliamentary systems around the world. So I think we have to have more honest conversations about the scale of the structural transformation, organizing, financing, decision-making at a societal level. And by societal level, I don't just mean government, I mean all our mechanisms of making decisions. And markets are a mechanism of making decisions. So is individual civil society, so is public state agencies, so are collective good instruments. And these are all broken. So if we want to do retrofit, one of the biggest small problems that we've got is how do you build emergent democratic legitimacy to do a whole street retrofit? Because you have to do street-based retrofits because you can't make an energy system work by itself. So I suppose I would like to push back a little bit that I think this is not just a product solution process delivery problem. I think these are structural issues. And I think the portfolios level stuff indicates for me that we need learning institutions. Yet actually, even most administrations aren't learning institutions. Parliament is not a learning institution. Parliament is a linear waterfall execution institution. So we've got a problem that portfolios build the learning capacity, but we need to rewire our democratic institutions to be able to actually become learning institutions. So what is a learning constitution? What is a learning parliament? What is a learning civil administration mechanism? These things all have to be linked in. So I think there's much more structural reform required in the nature of our institutions, which I think we're sort of slightly ignoring in the hope that we'll get there, because I think the problem is systemic. And one thing I'll say is climate change is just a symptom. It's one of the first symptoms, but it's just a symptom of a much more structural failure of how we relate to the world. And that requires deep renegotiation and politics at a scale we haven't seen yet. So that would be my kind of learnings from the last 5 years.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you for setting the bar so high on this discussion, and for sort of laying it bare for us, and relaying the real, I think, sense of urgency to all this, and the radical nature of the change that's needed. And what we really want to get to grips with in this session is about some of this stuff around how organizations work. So the governance aspects to it and the financing aspects to it as well. So thank you. Giulio Quagliotto is the head of our Strategic Innovation Unit at UNDP. He works with governments and across UNDP to develop renewal capabilities and accelerate impact on complex development challenges. Giulio, system transformation is embedded in UNDP's new strategic plan, and UNDP, through various initiatives in various countries, has been investing in learning on how to work with complexity and system challenges. So what's coming out of this practice?
Thank you, Francine. Just picking up on where you started us, actually, in terms of our journey is started quite a long time ago. The seawall versus the marshes is actually probably a good definition of what we're trying to do, although it feels very often still we are in the seawall type of world. It's been a painful journey. Duncan, who spoke before, might remember an initial conversation we did on complexity a few years back. That was quite painful at that time. It was still new language. But it's really about the question that in a very different way, Indy asked. How do we avoid having the instrument of the approaches for learning and innovation as learning inside organizations that are actually not structured to do that, but are still designed for accountability and are still designed for linear planning? how do you solve this? What do you do practically about it? How do you avoid saying what is, by now I think most people would accept, just common sense. 5-year plans, really, we heard it from the Deputy Prime Minister in Macedonia, don't make sense anymore. Our log frames really are designed for a different type of world. We know that siloed approaches are not coherent with the nature of challenges like climate change. We all know this. We all say this. We say we need to embrace complexity. What does it look like in practice? How do you actually build this inside an organization that is in itself part of a system, right? So when we actually say, well, we need to embrace complexity, many colleagues would say, yeah, this is great, but the donors, the people who fund us, are still asking us for very linear type of reporting. And this is why the collaboration with BIN and the EU is such a refreshing one, because it acknowledges this, right? And so what do we do about it? What does it look like in practice? Our journey has been full of trial and errors and some of the things that we are learning in the process. We thought that this would be ultimately about talking about speed and agility, but actually what we are finding out is that much more about questioning the identity. So if our identity is built on being solution providers, the way that our first panel said it, it becomes incredibly difficult to say, I don't know. And it becomes incredibly difficult to acknowledge the scale of the challenges that actually Indy was talking about and provoking us about. And we thought that the beginning, the entry point for trying to build this acknowledgement on complexity and agility was either train everybody to death on design thinking, foresight, etc., or that it would be something about identify entry point in our projects and how to do things differently. In reality, we discussed that this is about rethinking completely the way we think about programming, the way we do implementation, the way we do monitor and evaluation. These are some of the things that are emerging. Practically, we started with making a major investment in what we call accelerator labs. We have 90 across the world. This is a big infrastructure that has built agility and starting questioning lots of the orthodoxy in many ways in which we operate across our programming. But this is not, has provided us with a whole new perspective on what is actually needed to really start creating the foundation of learning, innovation as learning. And this goes beyond, as Indy said, producing lots of pilots and experiments to start asking very different questions about the structures and the root causes of the issues that we are dealing with. And so just like Climate Kick, we have invested in something that we call deep demonstrations. We have 9 around the world, starting with a new round of 7 that are looking at questions like borderline communities in Burundi, or how do you transform a whole economy towards a circular paradigm in Vietnam. And these are ways for us to start surfacing much deeper questions about how do you change the patterns of decision making inside an organization that is designed fundamentally for predictability. And where we are now is, the next stage of this is to start looking at really some of a deep code of the organization, right? So we just stood up, for example, a sandbox to look at different ways of doing monitor and evaluation that are suitable for the world of high level of complexity. So as an organization, this is, it's almost like ripples, starting from a place where we thought that, training, quick fixes could actually turn us into a learning organization. We're actually realizing that the investment is much bigger and deeper. And it's really about starting questioning how we understand some of the structural issues. What is our identity and our role in the places where we operate? And ultimately, how do we engage and interact with others in this space in a very different way, which is not, again, as solution providers, but actually joint investment in research and development, because we don't have the answer and we need to be able to operate at a different level. I'll leave it at that, Francine.
At the beginning, Indy talked about finance, the importance of finance and banking, and that bigger ambition towards system transformation needs a different kind of financing. So I'm now going to turn to our next panelist, Ines Rocha. Ines has 20 years of experience in the finance industry and in capital markets. Ines currently works as the director of the team that makes financial products for SMEs in EBRD. Ines, you've worked on the development of social impact bonds in Palestine and Armenia. And I know that the idea behind impact bonds is to try and take on board some of those externalities that Indy was talking about that aren't currently being factored in enough to the way we work. And I think the idea of impact bonds does have many similarities with portfolios in the sense that they're adaptive, they're flexible, and they're meant to build on the sort of emerge from the interventions themselves. So could you reflect on that engagement that you had with investors when you were designing those products? What was their response? And provide some tips for us when we're working on portfolios and are looking for financing.
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting, exciting discussion. So as EBRD, as an international financial institution, and in fact, as other MDBs, we play a critical role in pushing for investments in a lot of the areas that we have discussed this today, including climate. So, for example, at the moment, EBRD, half of our projects are for what we call the green economy. So MDBs play a particularly important role, and we ask ourselves the question, is the way that we invest, is the way that we use donor money, and I'm very glad to see here, DG Near, who's an incredibly important donor to the work we do. Is this the best way of achieving the results? And my colleagues were talking about monitoring, reporting, if self-evaluation. This is an extremely important part of the work we do to achieve more. And so we have done an experiment using an impact bond in West Bank and Gaza in collaboration with the World Bank. Now, an impact bond is not a bond. I know that the title is a little bit misleading, but it is a vehicle. It's a financing vehicle which works as a kind of like a portfolio of approaches on grants. But it has two very different things. So it has a private sector mentality. So there is actually a management team that is attached to that vehicle who has the ability to change the course of action according to different circumstances. So, we talked about, and also the previous panel talked about, the adaptability to real time. So an impact bond has that ability. And then the other very different thing is that it has this private sector mentality. So you only get repaid if certain outcomes are reached. And so this is what was also very interesting for investors when we were discussing co-investing in the vehicle, because investors, and in particular impact investors, want to see the actual results. And what we have seen, and I'll give you just a bit more detail on the impact bond in West Bank and Gaza. So we wanted to tackle the issue of unemployment in young people in West Bank in particular. And what we have done is we've identified the pockets on sectors that needed skilled people. So it was more about finding the jobs first and then training the people than the other way around. And interesting enough, we identified that there was a lack, and note this was pre-COVID, but there was a lack of knowledgeable staff in hospitals for infectious disease control. So we started training people, and I've actually visited personally some of these hospitals as well. We started training people in hospitals in Jerusalem and in West Bank for specifically infectious disease control. Now, all of a sudden, COVID hit, and the demand for actually people that were trained in this area increased dramatically. So we had a number of parallel projects that we were working on, including, for example, training for health and safety on construction buildings. But we quickly shifted the trainings for more people on the area because we saw that there was demand. And the interesting thing is that, and my colleague before also talked about the linear reporting that we usually do, the more traditional type of grant work that we usually do. So in this specific project, the KPIs were drafted in a way that we could do this shift of donor money usage of the grants immediately to a different type of reality. So we had this ability of adapting to our learning. And, as an outcome, as a clear outcome, we've actually had, last time I checked, there were over 20 people that are now actually employed in stable jobs around infectious disease control in the hospitals, which is, it's a really good start. So this is just a specific example of a different way of financing through a mechanism that has embedded in itself a learning process, and also by its design, a capability of adapting to different realities and to different types of complexities. And also that portfolio approach, the fact that we had different types of actions that we could pursue from the start up front, really gave us that flexibility. So it's an interesting example, and we're now working also with UNDP in developing something in the dairy sector for Armenia, which is also very exciting. But it does seem to be, a promising mechanism in terms of dealing with more complexity and being able to adapt.
It certainly sounds like an interesting mechanism for dealing with complexity and attracting funds to some of the issues that we're dealing with. It's clear from that example that we're all trying at once to develop new concepts, while at the same time trying things in practice and responding with urgency to, unexpected issues as they come up, like COVID. And essentially more and more, we are being required, I certainly feel it, to act like a lab in order to be relevant and respond properly to the things around us. The country office that I manage in Serbia has been deeply involved in thinking about and operationalizing a portfolio approach. And the reason for that is really simple. We here in Serbia have this omnipresent problem, depopulation, which is about shrinking population because of declining fertility and high levels of outmigration. And none of the tools that we have, it's definitely a structural systemic issue, and none of the tools that we have are really equipped to deal with it. It's a problem that's not specific to Serbia. Many countries in the region experience it, but it's quite specific to Europe and this part of Europe. And we feel it's actually going to get worse when countries join the European Union rather than getting better. So we started working on this about 2 years ago now, and it very quickly became evident to us that it's the type of interconnected, messy 21st century problem that we're really not equipped within society to deal with, rather like the kind of problem that India was talking about. It's very, very serious. It has huge development repercussions, potentially. repercussions for labor, healthcare, pensions, and public systems more generally. It will exacerbate regional differences within Europe. It depletes human capital, and it even has environment consequences. And yet it's practically really difficult to capture, pin down, and define. Is it a cause? Is it a symptom? Is it externally driven? Is it externally driven? Will it just pass and fix itself if we wait? Or does it need urgent attention now? And if it does need urgent attention now, where do you start? And there are no precedents. There's no global expert on depopulation. There's no global best practice on which we can rely. So we set about working on this seemingly impossible issue, engaging with traditional and non-traditional partners. And as a result of this long and very intensive process, we've now come up with a framework that transforms how we look at demographic change, respecting the complexity of the issue, the interconnected nature of the issue, and really broadening out. Once we look at the framework, it just opens so many possibilities and spaces for change. And I think the point that Kirsten made on climate change really, really spoke to me as well. She said, climate change is not a sector or a problem, but rather a context for making decisions. Something like that, I'm paraphrasing. But that's exactly how, after this time, we're seeing depopulation. It's not something that can be solved. Actually, we don't think we can really reverse population decline. So it's not something that can be solved, but rather something to consider in a variety of policies and strands of work. And so instead of looking for a silver bullet, we really need to build this ecosystem that others have talked about, that Duncan talked about, a collaborative ecosystem of actors. We need to test diverse and integrated action over time in many different areas. We need to continually drive. It's not like you do the analysis and then you do the work. We need to continually deepen our understanding of the system, of the structure, of the demographics, and the interlinkages within it. And we need to actually socialize a new narrative around what is possible, what is a realistic level of ambition when it comes to the goals of population policy. So I wanted to just describe this because this is one example of what's going on, but there are many, many examples within our organizations of applying systems thinking that are now happening around the world. And so we are, I think, increasingly moving beyond single point solutions, probably not with the urgency and the scale that we would like, but we are moving from single point solutions to systems and portfolios, and learning is growing. So in this second round of questions, we want to go into this in a bit more detail. And so I'm just checking if we've got any questions coming. But let me go into the next round of questions. And please, if you have questions, put them in the chat box and we want to answer them. But Indy, going back to you, you have this phrase of the boring bureaucratic revolution, which sounds fascinating to me. And we want to hear more about this boring bureaucratic revolution. What advice do you have for organizations who are trying to institutionalize learning? We talk about dynamic management now, but within big organizations, how do you actually dynamically manage portfolios across an organization? Another more operational, boring question. You mentioned it before, but how do we then start financing this process that is transformative, but where we don't have a clear idea or understanding of the results that we're trying to achieve yet? And then, a third component is around monitoring and evaluation. How do you be accountable to stakeholders, to taxpayers, again, when you can't commit to specific results, but really to learning. So can you give us some of your insights on some of these more boring but also fascinating questions?
Thank you, Francine. I think those are really critical questions, actually, and I think everyone in the panel has been, I think, either directly describing them or directly describing the need for them. So I think one of the big paradigm leaps is going from control-oriented organizations, and we've been trying to mitigate control. So control-oriented organization, the CEO perceives that they're in control. It's a perception problem, it's not a reality, but there's a perception of control. And boards perceive that they are in control and thereby hold the risk. Now, in a control-oriented problem, what we've been trying to do, and you've seen the whole conversation across governance, which has been about adaptive, agile, and what was the third one? 3 A's, AAA governance models, which are adaptive, agile, I can't remember the third one. It's another one of these A's, right? And actually, all of those things are still about holding control, but making control a little bit faster, a little bit more adaptive, right? But they're not about actually changing the theory of control. Now, the problem with control is not that, I'm not even going to go into the moral idea of control versus non-control. Control in a complex emergent world is virtually impossible to deliver. So one of the biggest problems that we've got is CEOs, in terms of if you look at the innovation landscape, they actually know about 7% of what the real innovation demands are on the ground. 7%, right? And boards even less, which is why when companies fall apart and boards are asked what happened, they were like, well, we didn't really know. And this is not a problem of boards. This is a problem of structures, of how risk is understood and how control is understood. So if we want to go from being a control-oriented organization to a learning-oriented organization, that fundamentally changes the idea of where risk is held, how learning is held, and actually accountability is structured. Unless you can actually drive that, that's a different cultural relationship. That may mean that the people at the top are not the best paid employees in the organization. Right? Management in that theory, which is a learning function, will not necessarily be the most innovative or the most valued function in the organization. It may be the people on the front line, may be better paid than managers. So we've got a management idea, which is all about control. We've got actually a risk model, which is all about this. So this is about how we organize in a complex world, right? And this is buried into your employment contracts. Your employment contracts are all defined in the same way. Your idea of how many holidays you have or can't have, how many hours you work, can't work. These are all control systems recognized. And some of these things be modified with regulation to make them better control systems than worse control systems. So one thing I think we have to really start to understand is this is not a moral crusade between control versus learning. This is a functional crusade between how do you deal with complexity. Now, the theory of predictability. So a lot of this is built on around the illusion of we can predict the future. So why have we got increased short-termism in finance is not because actually finance doesn't understand. It's because making long-term predictions is really difficult and really fraught with risk. So what you have is a tendency towards short-termism, or at least the ability to liquidate your investments at a very rapid rate. So when we talk about any societal impact bond, any societal impact bond, for it to be meaningful, has to probably operate at the scale of a city and probably operate over the scale of 25 years. Because its intergenerational value is where you're going to unlock most of the value. We're neither able to do intergenerational value, and nor are we able to operate capital at that scale. So, and the reason why I say operate at that scale is threefold. I think you could have an impact-oriented investment, which is about a single indicator, shifting a single indicator. You can have a system-oriented investment, which looks at the system benefits and be able to price those system back in, a little bit like urban forest. Or you can have a universal investment problem, which actually is able to capture not only the system benefits, but the spillovers, the ambient spillovers of value, like the local currency multipliers, various other effects that happen over the ambient value function. Now, those are three different types of business model and value model that construct completely different instruments. Most of our instruments have been constructed around theories of impact and short-termism. So this to me is a structural worldview problem. So, I mean, I would, and maybe this is a conversation for all of us to have, it's very clear to me, one, we don't have the quantum of capital on the table. And we keep focusing on private capital, but 4.5 trillion plus, and it's plus a year that's required to deal with climate change, it will not almost certainly be driven by debt. And the reason is that most of our prices are inflated in a way that we've had massive price and mispricing of the liabilities. So we've got a really big correction coming, which currently is going to be talked about as inflation. But the reason why our food systems are going to go up in value is not inflation. It's not monetary inflation. It's largely to do with actually risk which has not been priced into our food systems, which has now started to be priced in. So we're having a systemic price correction going on at the same time as having to deal with some structural issues. So for me, we have the quantum of capital. Second is the distribution of that capital. So decentralization of capital production is fundamental to dealing with this problem. If you look at Germany and the middle shaft economy, the middle economy that happened in Germany, it was a function of distributed capital production, micro banks, which are sector specific in between 1950s to 1980s, 1990s, mid 1980s. They were actually a distributed banking infrastructure which was able to finance actually for value at a system scale, because they could build portfolios that were specific to that context, that weren't looking for single unitary value. We've seen the massive concentration of capital in the hands of few, which pick deals rather than build virtuous local portfolios. So capital production, so the quantum of capital, distribution of capital, and the third one is the structuring of capital. So and I really love the fact that we're talking about portfolio financing. So we are going to have to finance portfolio deals at a virtuous locational level that is going to have to look at the intergenerational problems. I personally think the work that we're doing is it's neither going to be debt or equity. It's going to be, I think we're going to have to look at new forms of underwritten token economics. So almost distributed quantitative easing as a mechanism to deal with some of these problems. So decentralized ability to print tokens and print them tokens backed by currency and then be able to cancel them over a period of time. So a new form of economic distribution, which is, I think, going to be required to deal with that. And if currently we're doing exactly that at the ECB level, or we're doing it at the Bank of England level, we're going to have to decentralize that capability to allow for distributed comprehension of value and to be able to construct that in new ways. And those token economics are coming to bear, I think, in a very quick time. So for me, and thank you for asking this question in that linked way, Francine, these are linked problems. So unless an organization is involved and being systemically a learning organization, understand risks in a different way, it's very difficult to hold portfolios, and it's very difficult to do the financing mechanisms that are required in these institutions. And that, I think, is a big structural transformation for Europe. And for me, this is inherent on driving democracies. If we can't solve this problem, then I think we cannot deliver democratic environments. Democratic environments require learning institutions. This is, I think, the paradigm leap for me. And this has to operationalize itself all the way through. Operationalize ourselves in the KPIs. So what indicators are we using? And I think the theory of indicators needs to be theory of indicators is not about the indicators. It's not about fixing to the indicators. Indicators are proxies for outcomes. The indicators need to evolve during the course of a contract. So how do you have metrics which are evolutionary systems as opposed to static systems? How do we see assets as generative assets as opposed to fixed assets with maintenance theories? How do we look at financing, which is actually able to be generative and positive? Again, it's worth looking. I'll finish here. Sorry, way too much of a trade. But Marshall Plan in Italy and how they funded the Marshall Plan in Italy was extraordinarily, really good work. So we're doing a lot of work right now, looking back in history at large catastrophic events and looking at actually the instruments that were built, because I think those are going to be really critical as we work forward into this stuff. So Marshall Plan in Italy, fascinating. They were looking at 4 bottom lines: return to government, return to employees, return to finances, and return to community. And they looked at that four-way bottom line as a key mechanism to understand the value of an organization, which means that you may be losing money for one partner, but you may be making massive amounts of contribution for other partners. And how do you build balanced portfolios off the back of that? I would say, I mean, we're all here together. I think one of the big things we need to be preparing for is a large-scale economic transition, almost like a post-war transition of our economies. And I think that is the work and preparatory work that UNDP needs to be doing and DG NIR needs to be doing, because I think that's what we're facing in terms of the scale of the disruption that we're about to face. That's it.
Thanks a lot, Indy. Giulio, I mean, how much does that resonate with you for UNDP about these kinds of shifts that have to happen within an organization and the organizational culture to be one more based around learning? I mean, UNDP's innovation journey has been a very long one and a very rich one. what does it take to and I know that you're leading the work to mainstream innovation within our organization. So what have you learned about that? And how does this change that we're trying to promote coexist with the business as usual?
Yes, thank you, Francine. I think it's always a challenge to go after indie, right, and try to bring that vision into a good old-fashioned development organization. But I think the feeling, I think, has been captured quite well by many of our colleagues, of being in the center of a washing machine, right? So we accept, just like in the process you described so well for Serbia, that the nature of the challenges that we are to face is different. We acknowledge that we are not designed to be a learning organization, that our way we actually is designed is actually mostly for accountability and reporting, and rightly so, because we need to be accountable. But that is really quite a different mechanism from an organization that learns. So we acknowledge that. We know that things need to change, but we are still operating within the old system, right? So we are in this circle, right, inside a washing machine, and spinning. But what actually have we learned, and what are some of the things that very practically have convinced us that we need to invest and continue to ask fairly persistent question of coherence? Are the way we are organized coherent with the nature of the challenges that we are facing? So we started with from the programmatic side. And again, the example you gave from the population is really a good one. And saying, okay, we cannot project our taxonomy into the problems. We cannot say because we have, a governance program, an environment program, etc., then the population is an environmental issue or a governance issue, etc. We need to accept and acknowledge that interconnectedness of this type of issues, and then say, how do we work it backwards from there? And the moment that you start doing this, what would be our traditional verticals, right? Our programs are challenged, right? So you inject this portfolio logic that says, well, you work it backwards from the nature of a problem. And the moment you start doing that, then you start challenging all the horizontals, because all of a sudden you realize that your monitor and evaluation system were designed for predictability. Your reporting is designed for upstream accountability, but not really for learning of the people on the front line. That the financing is not necessarily adequate to the nature of a challenge. This is very much in line with what Indy was saying. Or, for example, with our capabilities, and again, we are still hiring, training, whatever, people under certain type of assumptions that I think by and large have been superseded by the type of things that are happening. So then, if you realize that you have all these things that keep kind of a lid on the organization to actually move to a different level and unleash multiplier effects, that exponential learning that actually Kirsten was talking about, what do you do about this, right? And so again, this is our journey for us to explore portfolios, started by questioning or questions of coherence of a programming, and got us into this much bigger journey about where do we generate multiplier effects by investing, for example, in different ways of thinking about monitor evaluation. So this is what I was referring to before. We are trying now different way of financing, right? So we put forward a blueprint for financing portfolios rather than projects, much along the lines of what Indy was saying, or starting to look at exploring different ways in which we can have relationship with donors to treat risk in a different way. So we, for example, redesigned a relationship in Bolivia with the donor, where we are actually saying, well, we are not going to do reporting the way we used to know it. We actually want to jointly manage risk in a different way, which means we are going to ask ourselves how we can continuously extract intelligence from the activities that we are doing that allow us to create new options, course correct, just like in the way that the impact board example by Ines showed, as things change? And how do we build the institutional will and capacity to take decisions differently? Because this is really where I think the rubber hits the road in terms of how do you actually change fundamentally the way that decisions are taken, either by distributing them, as Indy was talking about, or by acknowledging that these patterns need to take us in a very different type of direction. This is our journey, right? We're still very much in the middle of it, but I think it's really about starting to say the moment you adopt this portfolio logic, you really start to unpack a much bigger structural incoherence between the fundamental way the organization is structured and complexity. And this is really what we are unpacking. And again, I refer to the example you made of the population in Serbia as a perfect example of what actually means, and the questions that this is raising in terms of how we organize ourselves, the skills that we need, how we report, how we finance this type of activities.
Exactly the questions that we're grappling with now, and they are radical, big, profound questions for the organization. We've been talking about the need for system-level financing, the need for more long-term approaches. And so I'm going to turn to Ines now. What can we learn from finance about managing risk differently and about opportunity and getting incentives and opportunity? And how do we bet on the future when we don't know the future? Do you have anything that that you can share with us on some of these big questions that we're grappling with now?
Thank you, Francine, for this really interesting question. So, what I could share is probably a little bit of our own experience. So the EBRD does about 10 billion of investments across our country's operation per year, and so we do have a very large portfolio, and I think that is part of our strength. Sort of the diversity of investments. And now we talked, and also the previous panel talked about, how can we plan for the unplannable, and how can we better design for complexity, which is difficult. And I would say, no matter how much we plan, and I've sat on quite a few of our, risk committees for this when we're analysing an investment and trying to see, different scenario and stress test to see what could go wrong, what could go very well. There's always the end tail, right? There's always a black swan that can appear, and we've seen this with COVID itself. But one of the, I think, keys to success, and something that we see on the private sector, and in that extent, I work with small businesses, and they are an incredibly source of inspiration on that, is that more than, trying to think about all the potential scenarios, which I think we will probably fail, or even if we do think about certain scenarios, we tend to be optimistic about the probability of occurrence. I mean, no one would be thinking about, for example, a pandemic, right? Is to me, the key to success is just the adaptability. What I wanted to say is that, the private sector cannot afford to miss out on this adaptability, right? Because in a more Darwinistic way, they will not survive, right? So I think adaptability is the key. More than planning for all events, is adaptability, and the ability to act quickly is the key to success.
Good. So thank you for. I think that's a hopeful message, that private sector and the finance institutions recognize that they have to change. We've got about 5 minutes left, and so what I want to do is just finish with one, if you can answer it really quickly, question to each of you that came from the chat. And let me read out the questions so you have a few seconds to think about it before you answer. So, question to Indy. what actually is the key role of entities like UNDP and EU in this transition, recognizing the enormity of the challenges you were referring to? So that's Indy. Then to Ines. Is EBRD ready to absorb risks related to complex structures of the social impact bonds and become a major investor in the near future in such mechanisms? And then finally to Giulio on the UNDP accelerator hubs and portfolio approach to achieve system transformation. Any example of synergies with the EU? So please, 1.5 minutes each, just to quickly finish here. So firstly, back to you, Indy.
Thank you. I think there's a big role, actually. I think certainly from the European Commission side, I think there are roles about, like neural networks, there are layers of learning frameworks. So you can have a learning, and these are learning networks, one on top of each other. They actually, which build reflexive capability of the agents closer to the problem. So I think there's a really powerful enabling role of building actually a level of consciousness for actors that are working at a greater proximity to the ground. And that learning framework becomes learning and resource sharing framework. And currently the way we're organized, there's massive coordination opportunities and recognition, building inter-organizational recognition. EU is already putting together fantastic work on the missions board, which I think is on the cities work, which is starting to build shared understanding around that. So there's all sorts of stuff on that level. I think the capability work, I personally, one thing I would have a big request for both organizations is please start looking harder at the structural issues. I think too many people are too scared to say, well, actually our democratic institutions don't work. And we've become tinkerers and edge players into the system. We know we do not have the system capabilities to make the transition. If the IPCC report 6 tells us this, it tells us this. We've done nothing compared to what's required. So I think I would plead for both organizations to start to look systemically at that failure and stop tinkering. And I think there's too much what I would call working through tongs. And I think we need to start having honest conversations about the scale of the challenge, the scale of the reform that's required, and the scale of the transformation. I think all of our lives are going to be materially and structurally different at the other side of this transition. And they could be different good, they could be different bad. That's all up for grabs. And I think the enormity of it is, I think, not being honestly declared. Because I think people are still saying, well, actually, maybe our jobs and our processes will be okay. They're going to all change. So that would be my plea, is let's have more honest conversations at the scale that's necessary. And, at the scale that's required, maybe we're going to be building 10 new cities, 15 new cities, because of actually, if we're talking about 1.5 billion people being on the move, the scale of the response is going to be of an order different to what I constantly sort of hear. And I think that requires imagination and capability that I think we need to be thinking about in a different way. Thank you.
Ines.
Thank you for the excellent question. So we have done the West Bank and Gaza project as a pilot project. And actually the way we have set this for us is that we wanted to learn from this experience and then see if we could scale it up. So I would say that we are still in the process of learning from this experience and see whether we can replicate this project into other regions. Also, because we need to find the right type of problem to be resolved and the right type of also institutions that co-finance with us at the same time. So I would say, it would be a learning sort of path for us on this one.
Thank you. And then finally, Giulio.
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think it would almost be too easy and a softball almost to say that this particular event and the EU Mayors for Growth initiative is exactly the example of a type of collaboration between the two organizations that we can build upon. And I think that in many different ways. One is a joint intent, which is really signaling to the rest, to other organizations, that it is possible, even within the constraints of our existing bureaucracy, to create a space to work with complexity and make it explicit. Secondly, to actually go from the theory to actually demonstrations on the ground within cities, working with mayors to actually see what this looks like on the ground. And I think there is an enormous opportunity, and I think extraordinary multiplier effects to be explored by turning from this, into a ripple that actually is taking over in other regions, in other spaces, with other organizations, and starting saying, do we have this common intent? Do we have infrastructure to bring change about? In our case, of course, it's accelerator labs, portfolios, our country offices. The EU obviously has its own infrastructure. How do we look this as a multiplier effect to bring many other organizations on board and work on the ground to show how intent translates actually through concrete demonstrations, and maybe reach some of a scale that Indy keeps us provoking on. So I think that's to me really, this would be really looking at this event and this initial program as a beginning of a broader movement, almost to signal to the rest of the development world and public institution, this is possible, we can do it.
Julia, and just to add to that, we are having a very good dialogue with the EU as UNDP on depopulation, both at the national level here in Serbia, but also at the regional level. So I look forward to continuing that. So let me just very briefly wrap up by thanking our panelists for a very honest and open conversation. I found it very interesting. I think that it is a fascinating time to be working in development, and I do think that there is an appreciation now that current models aren't cutting it, and that we do need to be more ambitious and more collaborative in nature. So for me, the key takeaways are that we really need a new management for uncertainty and everything that involves, managing for uncertainty and different levels of risk. And that, to use Indy's words, that we need to stop tinkering, be much more ambitious, and really look at the structural issues. I have to say that from my own experience here in Serbia, working on depopulation, when we work on complex issues like this, it's not that it's overly complicated. People intuitively get what we're talking about, and it seems that they really like it. So I think this approach is something that people get and people have a strong appetite for when it comes to the different stakeholders. So finally, let me just finish with a call to action that, let's look at how we can radically collaborate together in different ways. So sharing early, sharing widely, and thinking together across portfolio, across silos, and across organizations, since that really is the way ahead. So thank you, Indy, thank you, Ines, thank you, Giulio. Let me hand back over now to Leila.
Thank you, Francine, and thanks to all the speakers. I'd like to invite for closing remarks Mathieu and Gerd Drogeman after him, who's the IRH manager.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists. I mean, it's been really fascinating. I mean, to listen to you and to hear your provoking thoughts also. So, but I mean, you see that we are all here actors of change, trying to bring a different dimension. I mean, of course, the scale of the issue and the scale of the response is something that we need to recognize, as many of you said. I think we have to accept also at the Commission and in UNDP to be a learning institution and not to be a knowledge institution. Many partners see us also as an authoritative knowledge institution, and I mean, all this dimension of learning is essential. And I think it's also what Indy was saying. I think who are we accountable to? I mean, are we accountable to the past plans that we elaborated some years ago? or are we accountable to the citizens at the end of the day? And if the portfolio approach is this, when we embrace complexity the way we propose to do, I mean, at the end of the day, we are accountable to the citizens at local level. And I'm very happy, I mean, to have partner countries like North Macedonia, I mean, embracing this attitude of looking at the results on the ground and building a strategy so that, I mean, we get this impact on the ground. So I think this is a transfer of accountability, which I feel is essential. I mean, if we want to keep being a learning institution and to grow as learning institution. But as I said, and then I support completely Giulio, and I like to thank, of course, our partners of UNDP and everybody today. I mean, I think this is a good example. I mean, it's still small scale, I mean, with our partnership, but I mean, it's a good example of how we can build together and think together about how to address this complexity and embrace complexity in our joint work, I mean, for the benefits of the citizens. So thank you very much. I mean, a big thank you to Leila, who's behind all of that, and her team, and of course with all the panelists, I mean, for their very dense and excellent thoughts. I mean, I hope everything was recorded, because I think it would be very useful, I mean, to look again, I mean, at some of the speeches, I mean, because it was very dense and rich. So thank you very much from our side.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. And let me perhaps also start with a big thanks to you, to Bing, to Thibault and colleagues on the EU side for this continued dialogue. I think today's session shows us again that this is just yet another little step on a way that is daunting in its challenge and daunting in its direction. When I hear you on the structural dimensions and the sheer scale of what we're facing, there's almost a paralyzing dimension to it when you look then from within an organization at the how-to and the steps that need to be taken, the ways that we need to go away from this more, say, control-oriented and current ways of linear thinking to a more distributed way of working, to a learning-oriented environment. It is almost impossible, Mathieu, as you said, to summarize the richness of this dialogue in all its dimensions. So really a big thanks to all the speakers and the moderators for how you have been outlining your perspective and your experiences in this context of complexity and uncertainty. The two takeaway questions that I'm taking from it after, basically having listened carefully together with all our participants to this discussion now for the last 2.5 hours roughly, is the one is on how we actually partner, and I think that's also for us as UNDP and in the Geneva or in the EU Commission to look at jointly how we come to a way of partnering that is far less project oriented in that sense, that is set up to learn together differently in the way that has come out of this discussion. And secondly, after the how we partner, really the question how we learn as well. It still seems to me as if we too quickly go back to the issue that we need to be a learning organization and we need to learn and understand things differently. But what exactly that means in terms of mindset shifts, in terms of culture change within an organization, but in front of the daunting challenges that actually don't really leave us much time to lean back and think slowly. So these two questions are, I would say, what come out for me as takeaways that will certainly keep me busy for a while on the how we partner and the how we learn against this background of complexity and uncertainty. So really a big thanks to all of the colleagues, all of the speakers, all of the moderators who have taken part of this event and have shaped this event today. I look forward to really continued engagement and close collaboration with all our partners, from Climate Click to Dark Matter Lab to the different partners in the EU Commission and across the board. I will not name everybody right here. With our government partners on the ground, I was really grateful to hear from the Deputy Prime Minister of North Macedonia, and I hope more and more we see similar type of approaches to these uncertain issues, as we have heard from the Deputy Prime Minister. Big thanks really also to all the colleagues who helped make this event today possible, being Thibaut on the EU side, Leila, Tina, Oscar, Lawrence, Anton, and other colleagues on the UNDP side who have made this possible. I hope very soon we'll have another round, where we dig deeper into the type of issues that we have come to today. It's certainly not the type of webinar, the type of seminar that, will ultimately bring us an immediate solution to the issues. But I think step by step, we are jointly learning in a different way to pick up, for me, the key word of today, learning once again. So with that said, let me not make it longer. Really big thanks to all of our participants, all of the colleagues who connected from the region and beyond, and everybody who participated in today's event. And I look forward to being Mathieu to work closely with you and the colleagues in the Commission as UNDP here in the region and beyond on these important issues in the future. Thank you so much.